Welcome to the Top 12 Highlights from Chapter 8. I'm Mr. Rodman, here to take you through public opinion, participation, and voting. So let's kick it off by talking about political socialization. We know there are many factors that help us to become socialized, but family is most important. We spend more time with them than with anybody else. It starts to change as we get older. We look at friends, we look at those at school, those as part of our religion or in the media. But family is most important in terms of how we are socialized, how we come to look at that political culture and ideologically how we overlay our ideology into that culture. So that makes a really huge difference here. Drastic changes can lead to additional participation. When there is a downturn in the economy, when things don't go well, then all of a sudden we see people start to participate. They start to vote. They come out to vote, especially if they've lost their job. Recessions are great for bringing out voters because they want to vote for change. They want to vote to change something up. Now, an attentive public is an informed public. Political efficacy, as we know, is all about the idea that we know and are informed and can take action based on the information that we have. An attentive public is basically an active citizen, someone who has political efficacy and exercises that internal efficacy by taking part. Either that's voting or joining a campaign or donating to a campaign, maybe joining an interest group or participating in that type of lobbying activity by writing a letter or going on an advocacy day or some type of a rally or something. That's really signs of a very attentive public, and we'll talk about more of that when we look at get out the vote. But part-time citizens make up almost 40 to 50% of our electorate, depending on the election. They tend to vote more in presidential elections, as we know, than midterms. But that is the extent of how they vote. So that really is different in that respect. Many of them and most citizens don't vote. As we looked at did not vote in a campaign, those that did not vote would lead an electoral landslide in the presidential election if did not vote was a category, because they'd win on an overwhelming amount. We have more people that stay home and wash the cat than actually go out to vote. And that's really sad, but that's why we teach about government. That's why the General Assembly in Maryland, in Annapolis, mandated that students participate in a government class so that they can know and have a political efficacy that is stronger and participate in those activities as a result. Now, public opinion, if we look at public opinion for a second, this is the idea of our individual preferences. What is our opinion based on news issues or events or other institutions that we have out there? We measure mainly through polls. And if you go to realclearpolitics.com, you can see all kinds of polls related to the presidential election, state by state, national polls, how do individual Senate races break down. And then if you look at individual states, a lot of times you can get more state by state elections on House districts or gubernatorial races, that kind of thing. But it's done through polls. It's done through random sampling. That's that random digit dialing. Everybody has an equal chance of being selected, which is the random sampling portion. It's assuming a margin of error plus or minus 3%. So if you're within that margin of error, that means it could go either way. If you're above that 3%, you're like, yay. If you're below that 3%, you're like, there's still hope, because you're within the margin of error. So that is a traditional standard of plus or minus 3%. And if you see a poll that is more than that, sometimes it's plus or minus 4% or 5%, depending on how they random sampled and how many people were as part of the universal polling, that margin of error may be greater, maybe 4% or 5%. Any more than that, and then it really doesn't become a poll. It's really just, putting your thumb in the air kind of thing. But universal polling, we can take a poll of about 1,100 citizens and get a good sample of what the country is feeling in terms of polling for the national election. Now, again, margin of error plus or minus 3%, but through random digit dialing and using polls, with this universal polling, everybody having an equal shot at being selected, we can get a pretty good idea of what poll is, what the poll may be in terms of that, how you would vote. Now, we've talked a lot about this in class, this idea of voter interest. We looked at the polls that we did in class and looked at the intensity. How strongly does someone feel about something? As well, the red stickers, right? In terms of the latent stickers, the blue stickers, in terms of an opinion that's held but not really expressed. Well, I don't really care that much about this issue, but if I did, I'd support it, but it's really low on the priority level. Salience is the idea of, hey, I prioritize this one. This is my red dot number one issue. This is more than the others, what I care about more than anything. So that has real salience in terms of if I had to prioritize, this would be that issue. And that's why we prioritized in class those 12 issues that we have around the room, because the idea is, how important is this issue to you, based on all of the other issues that are out there, and that is the one that's most salient. Now we get to voting, most important political activity. Now again, 60% of us do it, 40% of us don't, and actually 60% of us don't do it in midterms or other special elections like town council or county council or more the local races. But we get a higher election voting rate when it comes to presidential elections. They vote in presidential elections more than any other. But still, that's only 60%. In other countries, it's much higher. You have people voting, but they don't do other things. We do a lot of other things really well. In terms of exercising our internal efficacy. But voting, unfortunately, even though it's the most important one, because if you don't win elections, you don't determine the policy agenda, you don't determine the priorities of the government, you don't determine what really matters and what people care about and what government should do. Now, it's important to note that elections are run by states. This isn't a function of the national government running a presidential election. Doesn't work that way. We do not have national elections. We have presidential elections, but they are run by states. So it is a state-by-state election for president, and the Electoral College then determines who the president becomes based on that vote of 270 votes. So we hold more elections than anybody, and that really goes back to our pluralistic tendencies, that theory of influence that we had through James Madison, the idea of no faction can control all of the levels of government and all of the branches of government all at the same time. But remember, that's why elections are run by states, and it can be messy. It can be very different from one state to another. That really makes a big difference. Now, the 1993 motor voter law really did help to improve voter registration. We only have one state, North Dakota, that doesn't have voter registration. You can go in and vote, and you essentially go in and vote. You don't have to be registered to do so. But every other state has what's called voter registration. You have to register, and they want to make sure that you're qualified to vote in their state before you do so. You can cast provisional ballots if there's a question, but the idea is that you are registered to vote in that state. And those registration deadlines are usually before the election, a month before, or sometimes 60 days, 45 days, just depends on the state. But there is the nice part about motor voter law is that the registration is automatic. So as you renew your driver's license or you get a driver's license, you can register to vote at the same time. And that really has improved a lot of voter registration as a result of that. Now, this is one way to improve it. Voter ID laws are a way that actually inhibit voting because many people, especially elderly people, don't drive, so they don't get a new ID every couple of years. So many of them don't have a photo ID because they don't drive. They don't go out and renew it often because they don't need it because they don't drive anymore. So that tends to be something that would inhibit voters, especially in more rural areas of the country. But that is an area where motor voter law tries to encourage more voter registration. Voter ID laws would be more inhibitive of that. Now, if we look at elections, there are different types, the presidential being the most popular, obviously 60% of them voting, as we discussed. So more voters participate in presidential elections than in any other. But we also have primary elections. Primary elections are when you vote within your party in order to see who the general election candidate will be for your party. So we're doing that right now. In Maryland, we'll have that coming up on April 28th, and that primary election will determine who is the party candidate to run in the general election in November. Now, it's important to note that in a state like Maryland, we have what's called a closed primary, which means that you have to be a registered member of the party, and you can change that pretty easily, but you have to do that before the election, before the voter registration deadline. You need to change your party affiliation in order to vote in that primary election. In Virginia, they have an open primary, so you can go in and you can select, hey, I want a Democratic ballot, or hey, I want a Republican ballot. You can do that on the day of the election, but not so in Maryland. You have to be a member of that registered member of that political party in order to vote there in that party. That's the difference between closed and open, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. An off-year election is also known as a midterm. We had that in 2018. That's where the members of Congress are basically up. A third of the senators are up for re-election, and you have all of the House seats that are up for re-election. So that can sway the House one way. It could it could move Democratic and stay in Democratic hands, or it could switch to Republican and become a Republican House. So it really just depends on the turnout of the election. But a midterm election, we saw it move from Republican to Democratic hands in a midterm general election, and that is when the president, it's an off year because it's not a presidential election year, which also means fewer people come out to vote. So the people that do come out to vote really do matter, and this is where voting is so important. And then we have what's called special elections, and that's when a member either resigns because they've been appointed to a cabinet position in the White House, or a member passes away, and someone has to be named by the governor of that state, and the special election has to be held as soon as it can be held in order to fill that seat. So a special election just happens ad hoc because it's based on a member leaving their post before their election position time has expired. Now, looking at how people vote, the important thing here is swing voters really matter. I mean, we talked about the idea of Downs' theory of rational choice, the importance of swinging to the left and Democrats win, swinging to the right and Republicans win, but those swing voters really get out the vote is really important, the GOTV strategy, because it's not just about turning out your base. Your base is going to get you to 30% or 35%, but to put you over, you really need to win 50% or 51% of the vote. How do you do that? It's through swing voters, and we know from Downs' theory of rational choice that there are more people in the middle that identify as either independent or moderate or leaning left or leaning right, and that's what's going to sway the election. Party identification, really important, especially in drumming up the base or those left of center or right of center voters, but we also look to candidate appeal. How much do people like the person that is running? Also issues. What are the issues that that candidate is running on? And do we care about those issues? That matters. And getting people out to vote based on that really matters too. Now, a valence issue is where candidates agree. That's really trying to show the credibility of a candidate. So, hey, we're Republicans and we all care about this issue. Shouldn't you too? Or we're all Democrats and we care about this issue. Don't you care about these types of things? That's a valence issue. So that's really trying to show credibility among the party base, among people that would be left or right of center in terms of that approach. A wedge issue would be those that really motivate voters because they separate the candidates. Did you hear so-and-so talk about that issue? Well, I would never do that. And that's why we need you to come out and vote for me. You should vote for me as a result of this. So it's really driving a wedge between the candidates in terms of their voters, and really motivating voters to get out the vote and come out to vote for the candidate that you care about, because otherwise you'll end up with that other candidate, and fear is a huge driving factor in a wedge issue. Prospective voting, what are you going to do for me in the future? Looking ahead, looking prospectively, what are you going to do for me down the road? And retrospective voting is that, what have you done for me lately? This was the Ronald Reagan approach. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? He said in 1980. And a lot of voters said, no, we're not better off than we were 4 years ago. That's the retrospective voting aspect. And that can lead voters out too, especially if they're not better off. Remember, I mentioned recession at the beginning. People vote. It's our most important form of political participation. But a lot of times they vote because they don't have a job and they want to vote for change. And so that drives a lot of voters out too. Prospectively, in terms of, hey, what are you going to do for me? You're going to do these great things, and look where I am. Versus, hey, I've actually had a great 4 years, and what have you done for me? You've done a lot for me, so I'm going to give you another 4 years. You know, that kind of approach. in terms of the retrospective voting. But the one we fear the most in terms of getting out the vote is voter apathy, staying home, having to wash the cat, and therefore you don't come out to vote. You come up with any reason at all, and that really is what the don't wash the cat is about. The idea that, hey, I've got to stay home and do laundry. Oh, I got to pick up the kids. Oh, I got to run the kids to basketball. Oh, there's 10,000 other reasons why I can't vote today. That really is the driver of voter apathy, and it is the most dangerous a reason or excuse for why we have voter apathy and we have voter turnout that ends up being lower than we would have wanted. And that's really what we try and fight in trying to keep voter apathy. It doesn't matter who you vote for, it matters that you vote. That really is the important aspect. So look here just for a second as we close out this chapter at who is more likely to vote. Pause the screen if you need to. And kind of think these through, and then I'll show you the answers, and we'll talk about them just briefly. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to take a look at that. So let's break it down into who is more likely to vote. Well, between college graduates and non-college graduates, it's the college graduates. They have a higher internal efficacy, and as a result of that, they know more about politics, they can participate more because they know more, and they're more likely to vote. So that's an important aspect. Then we have older Americans that tend to vote. The senior citizens that go out to vote, and they go out to Applebee's for the senior citizen discount with all their friends after the voting. It's like a holiday to them because they really get all dolled up and ready to go, and hey, going to impress so and so, and go out to vote, and then we'll go out for lunch, and they really make it a social affair. They have that flexibility because they're retired or not working, and they can do that. Younger Americans, they're trying to fit it into their schedule, which is why they don't vote as much. They're the ones that stay home and wash the cat. That's really tough. Churchgoers, religion is a socialization aspect, and this can drive people out to vote versus non-churchgoers. People that go to church hear it from those that they socialize with at their religion or their synagogue. And so as a result, they're more likely to vote. Men versus women, we see women out to vote more. Women, again, exercising that higher internal efficacy and that political efficacy in terms of knowing how government responds to the people and wanting to take action and seeing themselves as a part of that. We see women do that more. We also see white people more than minorities that tend to come out to vote. Again, a lot of times the difficulties of getting off work and taking time to be able to do that is a problem that we see among all of the other groups, demographic groups as well, but particularly here in terms of the types of jobs they hold and how that plays out. But the idea here is we tend to see white or Caucasian voters vote more than minorities do. And unfortunately, that leads to less representation in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, in the local offices as well. We also see wealthier individuals that can vote more than poorer people. Again, probably because of schedules. They have more flexibility in their schedule throughout the day to get out to vote. Now, most polls are open, 12, 13, 14 hours. A lot of times, they open at 6, they close at 8, or they close at 7. They're open a good 12, 13 hours a day. So really, to not be able to find time to spend, a half hour going in and voting, you really have to be committed if you're spending longer than that. And poorer people don't have time in their schedule. Usually they're working menial, very manual labor jobs, and that's really difficult for them to find time at the end of the day to do that. They're picking up the kids, that kind of thing. Rural voters vote more than urban voters. We come up with any reason why we have to stay home and wash the cat. And rural voters, they get out to vote. Now, I've also heard that because of the rural voters, it's also easier to get in and get out in a lot of cases. That depends on the time of day in terms of voting. Some rural locations, it's much easier to get in, vote, and leave. Urban areas tend to be more concentrated in the morning rush hour or the evening rush hour, so that has an impact too. But we do see a lot more rural voters that are voting than urban, and that is reflected across the electorate. And then Midwest, more in the Midwestern versus the Northeast, we see more Midwestern voters. And again, going back to the rural white mentality, churchgoers that we see there also tend to vote more. in that respect. And I think that ties to the rural-urban dichotomy as well. So I hope you found this helpful. Remember to live the 5 on this chapter. Remember, polling is really important, that margin of error plus or minus 3%. We really need to poll about 1,100 voters in order to get a universal poll, one that is truly accurate and representative of the people. And the most important form of political action would be voting, and unfortunately only about 60% of us do it in presidential elections. It's a lot less than that in midterms or special elections. It can be really, really small. In a special election, could be 8 or 10% of the people that end up deciding who the elected official is, which is really sad. But that's why we teach government, and that's why we exercise our political efficacy. So live the 5. Good luck on the upcoming quiz, test, or exam, and we will see you in the next chapter.